Workshop of the Year on designing and implementing Python libraries. Dr. Rokum is a senior scientist at the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics, and he's also the principal investigator of the Rokum Neuroinformatics R&D Group and founded the NeuroHackademy Summer Institute for Neuroimaging and Data Science. And before we begin, just a quick note that this workshop is being recorded and we'll share it on our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them right away. And with that, I will hand over to Dr. Rokum. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me to give this workshop. I am excited to dive in. Let me start by sharing my screen here. Actually, I'll just share my whole screen. And then I have a few PowerPoint slides that I'll start with, and pretty. So as mentioned, the workshop's topic today is designing and implementing Python libraries. But before that, let me just introduce myself a little bit. As mentioned, I'm a senior scientist with the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. My work focuses on developing analysis methods for neuroscience data, with a particular focus on white matter tractometry. I won't go into what that is exactly here, but you can go to tractometry.org to see the kind of software that we develop. And then we use these tools to study a range of different questions, like how do baby brains develop early in life? What is the topology of brain development in adolescence? How is adolescent brain development affected by the COVID era? What are the links between white matter and cognitive aging? What are differences in circuits between individuals with schizophrenia and comparable controls? So I think of myself as someone who, most people, I think scientists divide into two. Some scientists have like a question and they use lots of different methods to answer that question. And some scientists like me have a method and we use that method to answer lots of different questions, as you can see. I love teaching about computational methods, and as mentioned, together with Talia Coney and Noah Benson now, organized NeuroAcademy, which is a summer institute in neuroimaging and data science, which takes place in Seattle every summer. We'll be here in just a couple of months. And relevant here, I'm the chair-elect of the OHBM Education Committee, so if you have things related to education that you'd like to see OHBM doing, I'm also going to be the liaison of OHBM Council to the Student and Postdoc Special Interest Group, which many of you are of course related to, so definitely reach out if you have thoughts. Okay, and this is my website. Okay, that was just a quick introduction of me. Let's talk about today's session. So today's session is based in large part on a session that I've been teaching for a few years now at NeuroAcademy, and it's actually that session is described in whole in a book that I wrote together with Talia Coney, Data Science for Neuroimaging and Introduction. Here's the cover of the book, but you can also find the whole book here on this website. So the content of the book is all freely available in neuroimagingdatascience.org. I'll bring up that website in just a bit here because I'll use that also as kind of like notes as we go along to sort of show you different things. Today we'll talk about a few different things. First of all, we'll talk about why you would want to design and implement a Python library in the first place. Like, what's the purpose of doing that? A lot of designing and implementing a Python library is about making that code available to others, to share that code with other people. And then the question becomes like, what about the code that we write as scientists should be shareable? What would make, your science better? What would make your life easier, other people's life better and easier? So you need to maybe consider before you dive into implementing a Python library. You should ask, before you do it, you should ask whether you should do it. And then we'll look a little bit at what is usually the way that I end up developing libraries. That I start with some analysis and it turns into a library eventually. So it starts as some analysis script, it becomes a Python module, and then it becomes a library. And I'll explain what these different terms mean because each one of these words, script, module, library, that means something in particular. So we'll talk a little bit also about software testing as we're talking about that. And then we'll talk about Python packaging. There's a way to take your code and package it in a way that others can use it. We'll talk a little bit also about software documentation. And in the end, we'll talk about making sure that others want to and can use your Python library. The purpose ultimately, like I said, is to share some code that you have um, with other people. So the question is, how do you make that easier for others? So we'll talk a little bit about software licensing as well. So I'm hoping to touch on all these things. Um, and it'll be a little bit, so I'll skip a little bit through things. And I have, um, baking or cooking show style. I have a final solution that I'll show you, and we'll sort of walk through that and that solution together as we work our way through the material. Okay, I'll pause here before I dive into things. What questions do people have so far? I will mention that if you have questions as we go along, don't hesitate to um, use the don't hesitate to use the chat. The problem with the chat is that it's hard for me to see. So maybe instead of chatting me, um, unmute yourself and shout at me, and hopefully I'll hear that. Or if you're very shy, Alex, would you mind monitoring the chat and just letting me know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So then if somebody kind of like loses track of stuff and asks something in the chat, you can stop and slow them down. Okay. Okay. So having said that, let's move from these slides to this web page where I will kind of walk through these notes. So as mentioned, this is part of this book. The book you can find at neuroimaging-data-science.org. And just to give you an overview of what's in this book, in case it's useful to you, it introduces a particular toolbox for data science that focuses on um, reproducible and open science. It focuses on, in the beginning here, a little bit on sort of software engineering tools and then programming in Python. We will be looking at this chapter 7 here. I'll just mention later on this stuff that's more about scientific computing, neuroimaging, Python, image processing, machine learning, all of those sort of topics related to data science for neuroimaging, and maybe topics for future sessions. But today, chapter 7. So um, let's talk first about like how you might come around to sharing code. So I'm assuming that most people that are here do some kind of data analysis with neuroimaging data, and during that neuroimaging data analysis that you're doing, you write software and or some analysis code. A lot of what looks like analysis code in our day today are little scripts that we write. So here's an example of what that might look like. So here's some imaginary Python code that somebody might write. Um, let's say that you're doing it in a Jupyter notebook. Who here is, let's do a little audience participation. Give me a thumbs up if you've used the Jupyter notebook before. Okay, so several of you have used Jupyter notebooks. So Jupyter notebooks are just one environment for interactive computing. Interactive computing is really important for scientific work because we can do things and then we can see immediately what we did and kind of follow along. I think when we write that kind of code, we do a few different things together. We might do something like reading some data from a file, and then we might extract something. Um, Sometimes people will talk about extract, transform, and load ETL pipelines. Those are all about getting data from some file and putting them in the format that we can then analyze. Maybe for the purpose of this analysis, we're calculating blob areas. So we have the radiuses of these blobs, and we're calculating their area and their circumference. And then we're creating some new data frame and we're saving that to file. So this is pretty typical for the kinds of things that we do when we do interactive data analysis. We're reading some data in, we're doing some computation with the data, and maybe we're visualizing or saving it out into an output. Um, but this, in fact, is not very reusable. There are a few different things about this code that make it hard to reuse. One is I've hard coded the names of files that I will read, and those are in my local file system as I'm running this. So if I gave it to somebody else, this code, I handed it to someone else in my lab even, they wouldn't be able to even run this code, and that's because they don't have these files. So I'd have to also give them the files and so on. So in that sense, it's not reusable. It also mixes together different things. It doesn't, the term in engineering is separation of concerns. It doesn't quite separate different concerns. It does the ETL, but it does this also some computing in here, and then it does some extraction of results and saves out those results. So it mixes together different things that maybe should be separated. The code at the heart of this is this scientific computing part that we're doing some computation where we're running some numerical code. In this case, the computation of an area and a circumference of a circle, and that maybe that if we want this to be reusable, we need to maybe separate it from how exactly we got those radiuses. Um, so one good general principle of software engineering that we'd like to incorporate into our work is that of modularity or separation of concerns. So our first step is to identify what are reusable components in this code and separating those separately into modular structure. Okay, so this is the first step that we did here in this code. Um, so it's the code that I have here does the same thing as this code, but now we've separated apart pieces that we might want to make reusable. In particular, we've written Python functions. This is let's see, just again, show of hands, thumbs up if you've written a Python function before. All right, let's see a few thumbs up here. Okay, several. Okay, looks like a large part. Okay, so I won't go into like what exactly a function definition is. Instead, just to point out that I've taken these lines of code that used to be embedded inside of other things and I've separated them out. So now it doesn't really matter how I extracted the radius, so long as I have a number that is a radius, or even in this case, a vector of radiuses in a NumPy array, I can calculate the area based on these radiuses by passing it to these functions or the circumference or the area. I've also separated the circumference calculation from the area calculation so that these two different things are separated from each other. Okay. Now, for me, the first step often in moving from a script to a library is creating what I'll call a little tools library that I use myself, or a little module that has my tools that I'm using. So the typical step here is to create a new Python file. Let me actually go and okay, can you see my terminal? Is that someone give me a thumbs up if you can see my terminal?
We can see it.
Okay, great. So let's say that I have a file in here. It's my analysis script.ipynb, and um, and it's the code that I had in here. So let's say that I started with code like this one. Oops. I started with code like this one and that's typical. I'll have a Jupyter notebook and this analysis script, and I'm working on it, and I write this kind of code. I'll pretty quickly start factoring out. It's called factoring out the elements of this that are reusable by changing the code to be more like this. Maybe pretty typical for me is that I'll have some functions at the top. Maybe um, maybe I'll have some imports at the top, and then I'll have some function definitions in another cell, and then I'll have all my analysis code below. This is a pretty neat way to organize a Jupyter notebook, have all your imports at the top, have all your code at the bottom, in between have your function definitions. I think it's relatively easy to follow. It's also the case that if I define the functions up here, I can reuse them if my notebook becomes large and I'm doing this kind of processing over many different data sets, I can reuse this down here. The problem with this is that uh, this code, these functions are now locked to this notebook. They can only be used in this notebook. So pretty typically what I will do is I will create tools.py file, and I will move these functions into my tools.py, maybe together with the imports that are needed for this code. So it looks something like this. Oh, it doesn't like this. This red squiggle tells me that that's not nicely formatted and needs a new one. Okay. Now, in order to know how to use this and kind of like why this structure works, we need to understand a little bit about what the import statement does in Python. And that's going to be important later also when we implement a full-fledged library. When we type import pandas as PD into and run that, um, what the Python interpreter does is it looks around and it says first, is there a file called pandas in the same directory as this script? And if there is, I will import stuff from that file. If it doesn't find that file, it goes and it looks in what's called the Python path, which is an environment variable that tells it where different Python libraries are installed on this machine. So it has these kind of rules. It kind of follows a sequence of rules about where to look for things to import. So it does, if it doesn't find it in the local folder, here I can do import tools, for example, and I will need to tell it where to take this from. This should work. Um, oops, that one is. So this works because there is a file called tools right next to this. And inside of the tools, there is calculate area, which is a function, and um, which is another function. So what Python did here when I wrote import tools is it looked in the local directory and it said, do I have in this same directory? And it's important that both this script and this are both in this same directory together, right? Here I have analysis script and here I have tools. If they are in the same directory, then it will see that and it will import this name from here, and that name becomes a name that includes various things. I can import tools as TL, for example, if I like two name abbreviations, and that name will have. And that mirrors, I'm hoping those of you who have programmed in Python before will have seen things like import pandas as PD. That's a very common way of us getting the pandas library, naming it as PD, and then we can use, for example, the read CSV function for that. So now my code becomes like something like this. From my tools library, I've imported my calculate area and my calculate circumference. They're right here, and I can reuse them not only in this analysis script, but in any other analysis script that lives within this directory. And many of my projects, many of my analysis projects really look just like this. Um, there's there's a tools library that has functions that I can reuse, and there's a bunch of these analysis script um, notebooks. I will usually name them something like that, 2026-05-19, and that's just so I get them organized, sorted um, in chronological order, and I can keep working on related things or other things in various notebooks. And all of those notebooks, whenever I work on one of these notebooks, and I see, oh, I have a function that's maybe useful somewhere else, I move it into this tools library. and tools library grows as the project grows. Um, okay, let me pause here actually and see what questions do people have at this point. I will look at the chat and see if there's. I have a bunch of AIs introducing themselves in that chat, but nothing else. So I assume no questions. Okay, I'll just pause here to do one more thing that I think is nice to do, which is to document what the code does. So I have this calculate area. It takes as input a single variable for my own sake so that I know what these functions do, I don't know, a year from now when I come back to this project. It's nice for me to add some documentation. And I follow a very particular way of documenting Python. In all of Python, if you put a string immediately after a function definition, that string becomes what's called the doc string of that function. So it's a kind of interact, it's like a document that's attached to that function. I'll show you how that works in just a second. In this case, let me actually, for expedience, let me just copy what I wrote here. So this thing calculates the area of the circle. It has parameters. It has returns. So it returns a numerical, which is the calculated area. It takes as input a numerical, which is the radius of a circle. Um, this is formatted in a very particular way. This formatting of the the doc string. I would recommend to use this particular formatting. This formatting is hews very closely to the NumPy doc string standard. So just Googling that, you will find that there is a style guide for NumPy documentation that follows very closely what I just demonstrated. It has a parameters section and it has a returns section. So if you follow that, then other people who write NumPy code can understand what you're doing. If your documentation follows the standard, then other people can start understanding what you're doing. And we'll get to that in just a second here because the goal is to share this. Okay. Oh yeah, and actually there's an example here of some analysis that I'm doing. It follows exactly the same format here. This is genuine analysis. I don't know, I'm analyzing some weird survey data here. It doesn't matter exactly, but just to demonstrate that in real life, this is exactly what I do. I write the date, I write analysis, and I go on and analyze. This just happens to be in my editor, but it's true to how I handle this kind of stuff in real life. Okay. So this is great. You're working along, you're doing this, you're working on your own. You have your tools library that you can import into various notebooks. But notice that so far I haven't told you how this code that you wrote into your tools library, how that gets to other projects and how that gets from you to other people. At some point, you'll want other people to come in here and be able to use the functions. Once these functions become very useful and you start seeing, oh, these are things that other people can use as well, you might want to share them, say, with your colleagues in the lab, or you might want to I don't know, share this with other people who would like to reproduce that you're working, the work that you're doing. So that's when you will want to start moving from the structure of this kind of analysis with the tools library into the structure of projects and a package. So the idea here is that it generalizes the same pattern. We had this pattern where we had some script code and we had like a tools library, and all the scripts in this project are using the tools library. Now we're going to move useful tools into a package, and many different projects can use stuff that is in that project. And again, sort of in a little bit of cooking show style, I've created this in advance for us to look at. So this is a project. It's called Geometry. It implements geometrical calculations on. Let me open it up in the Finder so it's easier to see maybe what the contents are of the file tree. We'll start by looking at the source directory, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the tests directory, and then I'll tell you about the stuff that's out here, which is metadata that helps you share this and have others use this as well. But let's start with the source directory. So this structure is the structure of a Python library. Python library will generally have some metadata at the top level. Here we have a README file, a pipe project file, and a license file. I'll come back to those later. There's a folder called SRC, which contains the source code. And then there's a folder called tests that we'll come back to later. Inside of the folder called SRC or source code, there is another folder called geometry. It's called the same as the top level code. And this, it doesn't have to be that, but in this case, it's easy for me to do that because I will want to use this geometry code. I'll want to be able to import from a name called geometry all the code. And it has a few different things. It has this PyCache folder, which is we'll leave a little mysterious for now. But the most important thing for us now is that it has um, a file called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And I will refer to this underscore underscore before an underscore underscore under as dunder. So that's double under, very quickly said. So this is a dunder init file. And it's much faster than saying the whole name of this file. Again, so this is called the dunder init file. Dunder, this kind of dunder pattern of having underscores before and after things, that's a pattern that's used in various ways in Python. So that's why we invented, or people in the Python community invented a quick way of saying it, dunder. So this dunder init file, uh, uh, the definition of a Python module is a folder that contains a dunder init file. If you have a folder and it has a name, like geometry, and it contains a dunder init file, it's a Python module, and it can be imported as such. Um, and the dunder init file doesn't have to have anything in it, really. In this case, the dunder init file is empty. It doesn't have any content. But the fact that this dunder init file exists here, that tells Python this thing is a Python module. And a Python module is a thing that is a name that can be imported into Python, into running Python processes or Python interpreter sessions. It can be interactive or it can be a session that you run non-interactively. What's more important is that it has a file in it called circle, and that file circle has, you'll see, some familiar code. Calculate area and calculate circ are the two functions that I had before. Now I've copied them into this file called circle that lives inside of the module geometry. And that's because when I'm starting to implement a Python library, maybe I have in my mind the idea that I'll have geometry of circles first, and maybe I'll have geometry of squares or polygons generally, or I don't know, something else under here as well. So I'm building my library to be generalizable, to be able to expand it. But for now, I've only implemented some calculations related to area and circumference of circles, and maybe I'll have some other geometry of circles also inside of this file. So having built this structure, this is something that can then be imported so long as it's installed on the machine that I'm working on, or in the environment in which I'm working. And in order for that to be possible to install, I need to tell Python how to install this machinery. Maybe before I go and show you how to install things, let me pause here and see what questions you have about this structure so far. I've built this structure. It's might be a little bit not obvious why this structure exists so far. So let me just see if there are any questions so far. I will mention, I mentioned this PyCache and said that it's, I don't see any questions either coming up or in the chat. I'll just mention this PyCache is here. It's something that happens when you import this. When you import this library, PyCache gets created. This dunder, notice dunder PyCache folder gets created. It's a kind of a thing that gets generated when the code gets imported, and it includes a thing called the bytecode of the code. So this is a way for Python to the first time that it imports the code, it compiles this into something called bytecode so that next time that you import this, it'll be faster to import. So this is just so you understand what this PyCache is. In fact, I can remove this PyCache and nothing bad will happen. I can still use this code. It'll get generated again next time that I import it. Yes, sure. I see your hand now. Question.
Hi.
Oh,
Sorry. Can you show the init and explain a bit more about this file?
yeah. The init file is an empty
Like
file
what?
in this case.
Oh, yeah, and what? Why? What are we?
Okay, the init file is here in order to tell Python that this geometry folder is a Python module. It is something that Python can import. Um, Sometimes we'll put things in the init. Um, what happens is when you run uh, from later, you'll see from geometry import circle, for example, the code from Python from geometry import circle, it'll find that there is like a folder called not like that there is a folder called geometry. It includes a name called circle, and it'll know that it can import from it because it includes an init file. And in fact, when you run that import statement, import geometry, if there is any code inside of the dunder init file, it'll get run. Let me demonstrate this by first installing this code. I will
Thank you.
activate an environment, um, and I will use the Python pip package manager to install an editable version of this package. Why this is possible is something that I'll come to later, but I want to demonstrate first that it's possible, show you what happens when it happens, and then we'll go back and trace back our steps to see why this is possible. So what I'm telling here, pip is the Python package manager. I'm telling it install. You might have seen things like pip install numpy, which go and find numpy in the Python package index and download the code and install it into your machine. In this case, we're doing an installation from this period here tells it install from this folder. So instead of going to find something on the Python package index, look in this folder and see if you find something that you can install here. And because I've provided a PyProject and the source and tests and so on, this should work. Okay, so it's doing something, it's installing something, it's actually installing some dependencies as well, and it has some, but it's in the end here down at the bottom, you'll see that it tells me that it successfully installed geometry. And so that means that if I go back to my analysis code, or actually let me start a new one um, and save that in the same place, 2025, 2026, 05, 19, analysis 2, and I run import geometry. And this one. Then it can do that. Import geometry as geo, let's say, geo dot calculate circ. Oops. Oh, maybe it was called calc circ. No, what was it called? Let me find it. Calculate circ. Let me try this one. Target area. Oh. Okay, from geometry, import circle as CC. Maybe this will work. Okay, yeah, that works. Okay, so I have to do from geometry import circle as CC because of the structure that I built. Sorry, I forgot that I built it this way. I have geometry, and inside of that I have circle. So I have to say explicitly from geometry, which is this module, right? It's a module because it has a dunder in its file. Import the name circle, as in this case CC, and then you have calculate area in here. Okay, and this is possible because I've installed that library into the environment in which I'm working. I see there's a text in the geometry. There's a module or a package. That's a good question. Module, package, those things are a little bit interchangeable. Module encompasses things like this tools file that I showed you before. That's um, a little bit kind of doesn't have a dunder init file. And module or package includes like package is a little bit more specific for things that have like this more formal structure. So it's a little bit interchangeable. Um, okay, one more thing that I'll show you now is that since I wrote in here, I wrote some doc strings. One of the things that I can do with these doc strings now is that I can write a question mark after the name of the function, and it will render the doc string into the notebook. This is possible only in Jupyter. This is not a general Python thing. This is possible in Jupyter and in IPython and maybe some other interactive environments that you might see. That if the function has a doc string and you write a question mark, then that doc string gets rendered into the interactive environment in which you're working. So that's a nice thing about having um, these doc strings written in this kind of formal way. It helps being able to test this code and I'll show that in a little bit. But it also helps users to know exactly how they can find help about functions without having to go and open the code, right? This is done without opening the code. Okay, so the fact that I've organized my code in this way, that it has a module in here and it has Dunder in it, or a package and it has Dunder in it, and that has Circle in it, that once I install it, it lets me run it like this. And in fact, I can copy this code, I can give it to somebody else, and they should be able to install it in exactly the same way by doing pip install. The -e here means editable, and that means that if I make changes to the code, the next time that I import it, those changes will be incorporated. I don't have to reinstall the code every time. I only have to install it once as editable, and then I can edit it and make changes. For example, I'll make a change here in the Dunder in it. I will add print, I am being imported. And let's see what happens if I import it. So if I re-import it now, nothing happens. And that is because Python is lazy. And even if you make changes to your code and you re-import it in a session, as long as that session is running, Python will say, oh, I've imported this before. I don't need to import this again. So what you do need to do is you need to restart the kernel and then import it. Let's see. And now when I imported it, you'll see that it says I am being imported. And the reason for that is that when you import something from a Python package that has a dunder init file, the code that is in the dunder init file gets run as part of the import operation. So in this case, I imported from geometry, I imported this circle module within it that has all the code that has to do with circles. But along the way, the dunder init file got run. And people use that in various ways. We won't use it here, but people use this in various ways to do various kind of like setup operations, like things that you want to happen every time that you import a package can happen because you put them in this Dunder init. So in this case, we're just signaling that it's being imported, but you can do other things in here as well. Okay, I hope that answered the question that was asked. I noticed that this PyCache has reappeared. Remember that I deleted it? It reappeared when I imported the code. So again, the Python, if you see these PyCache folders, just know that that happens when you import the code. Python compiles the code into byte. It's called bytecode. This bytecode is these PYC files. You can't really open them. They're not legible. There's some binary format that we can't really read. They're in there, and next time that you import, it'll import quickly because it's got this bytecode. It actually, in this case, it does check if there are any changes. So regenerate the bytecode. If you made changes, those changes will go into the bytecode as well. So it's not like you need to delete this every time you make changes. You can keep this around, and you can ignore it. Okay. So far, just to reiterate what I've done, is I wrote some code in a notebook. I moved it into a tools library, and then I found this is really useful and I would like to share this with others. Let me put this into this formal structure of a Python library, which I have here, and let me share that with others by arranging this in a way that others can use it. Okay, so far I've only shown you what's going on inside of the source folder. Let me go one step further to show you what is going on with the metadata. So the metadata is important, and that's because the metadata is something that pip will use in order to install things. Let me start with this README file. the easiest one. The README file is actually not for pip. It's for humans who happen on your code and want to use it. And it's pretty important if you're going to share this with other people to include some explanations about what the code does. There's different levels of documentation. One level of documentation is the kind of documentation that we have here. Like each function has its own documentation. But another level of documentation is to tell people what this thing is, what it does. You might tell people things like how they might contribute to this and where they might get help, like by posting issues on a GitHub repository. I'll get to this GitHub repository in just a second here, because that's one way that we can share the code with others is by creating a GitHub repository, putting the code on that GitHub repository, making that code available publicly on that website. So that's the README file. It contains documentation for people. The PyProject file contains documentation for machines. This is metadata about the project. And it uses this TOML format. The TOML format is a kind of formal language for writing data structures of this sort. It's a little bit like a Python dictionary. And so there's top level keys, this build system key, this project key, this project URLs key, something about packages down here. And then within that, you might have like some other items. So first, let me tackle this one. At the top, I tell it about the build system. The build system is the system or the software that a package manager like pip will use in order to install this package. Are we using setup tools? It's one of the several options that you have. Setup tools is a very kind of standard and also very old way of installing Python packages. It's a bunch of tools for like identifying where the code is and how to organize it to put it on the user's machine in a way that they can use it. So that's why we use it. It works. The next thing here is a bunch of metadata about the project. So there's things like the name of the project, the authors. You can put a whole list of authors in here. In this case, it's just me. There's a short description. You tell it where the README lives in this file called readme.md. By the way, this is Markdown. Markdown is a lightweight sort of markup language that tells it that this is a top level title and this is a second level title and so on, and this is a link and so on. So we point to this Markdown file and say that's where the README is. Then there's some metadata about classifiers. These classifiers are ways in which this code will be incorporated into directories like the Python package index. It's metadata that tells people who are searching for code about, for example, science, they can use that. It's like a tag that tells people this is what this is. There's a question here, is the TOML somehow generated automatically or do I need to define it myself? Typically, this is something that you write by hand. So I provide an example here, and I'll show you where this example is online as well. As kind of a starting point. And I'm walking you through this a little bit carefully and kind of slowly, and that's because I've found that we can do what's called cargo culting. We can give you something, and you can just kind of like try to repeat this. But often, if something goes wrong and you don't know what these things mean, then it's hard for you to debug. So I'm kind of walking you through what these different things mean. You can, in practice, take and copy this over into your project now that you know what it means, edit the different things to, reflect the code that you're writing, and hopefully you'll be able to debug when things go wrong. So this is a template for you to use, but also I want you to kind of see what's in there. Okay, these are the classifiers. This next section is about the dependencies. I'm telling the installing machinery that this requires Python of a certain version or above. And then I tell it about the dependencies. The dependencies are all the code that is required in order to run this code. For example, we're using pandas, and I'm defining a particular version of pandas. So I'm going to ask it to install a specific version. It's not a bad idea to pin. This is called pinning, to tell this version of pandas, not any other. And that's because as Pandas updates, they might change the code in a way that breaks your code. And you want to make sure that people who use your code use the specific version that you use so that they don't get bugs that relate to the fact that they're running a different version of Pandas than the version that you're running. So pinning the version is not a bad idea. This next string is the version of this software. So I'm telling, when I installed it, you probably saw it said, successfully installed geometry 001. Look, it also installed pandas 222, and that's because that's the version of pandas that I pinned. And then it installed geometry version 0.0.1. Usually these kind of strings for versions, this is called semantic versioning. This is the major version, this is the minor version, and this is the micro version. And you can communicate with users of the software about changes to the software by changing the version number. So once you've done this significant amount of work, you might say, okay, I'm ready to release version 1.0, sorry, 0.1. That's like a first minor version. Once you've worked on it for a while and it has substantial amount of functionality, you might say, I'm going to release 0.1. 1.0, sorry, 1.0, that's a major version. So that's the first major version of this software. And maybe if you do some additional work that doesn't really break anything, but just adds features, you might say, oh, now I'm ready for 1.1. And then maybe if you do a really large amount of work and maybe you add features that, or you change some of the ways that things are called in a way that breaks some of the functionality of 1.0, you might increment this major version. So semantic versioning tells you a little bit about the maturity of the software and it tells you about major changes that happen to the software. Okay. The next thing is the URLs related to the project. In this case, maybe there's like the homepage and maybe there are issues where to post issues. So I put that there. And then finally, there's this little section here that is about how to install packages that relate to this library. So I'm telling setup tools that they're packages and that you can find those packages inside of the source directory and that you should include everything that is inside of geometry. So geometry, and this is the wildcard star to tell it, include everything that's in there. But do not include when you install any directory that has tests in it. So I'm telling the package manager and setup tools, install all of the stuff that's inside of the source directory, everything that is inside of geometry. Do not install tests because the tests are there more for development than for the end users. Okay, so that's kind of the structure of the metadata. Let's see, what questions do you have about this metadata? That was a lot, so would understand if there's some questions. Okay. There's one final bit here of metadata called the license file, and I'll come back to that one. Before I come back to that one, I did want to show you that this is all, everything I'm showing you here as an example does live in a GitHub repo called geometry. Oops, really? Oh, I didn't push it. It doesn't, so, okay. So next I won't teach a lot about Git today. I will just say, once you've written all your code, and I'm hoping there will be another session like this that will talk about Git and GitHub. So you'll have opportunities to learn about Git and GitHub. And if you already use, actually, show of fingers, who here uses Git to track code that they, okay, I see few thumbs up. So that's maybe another session for another day. I will just initialize a repository here, and add the files into it. Whoop. without going too much into the intricacies of GitHub, once you're ready to share your code with other people, it might be a good idea to use something like GitHub as a code sharing platform. But again, this session is not necessarily focused on GitHub, so I will and I typoed the order of commands here because it's a really long. Okay, having done that, now the code has appeared here. So we have this source geometry with its dunder in it and its circle.py. All the code that I showed you on my machine is now over here. And this is neat because now I can give you this link instead of copying the code to you. I can give you this link and you can go to this link and you can download this. This is publicly viewable. So it's under GitHub. I'll copy it into the chat so you can verify for yourself that it's right there. And you can download my code and you can install it in exactly the same way that I installed by doing a pip install dot. Once you've so pip install dot will install this into the environment on which you're working. That's one way to get the code from my machine to your machine. Okay, one last thing that I promised to talk about, this license file. So this license file may look really well crafted, and that's because I have not being a lawyer, I have copied this language precisely as it is from a formulation that was defined by other people. Why do we need a license in the first place? Well, if I'm making my code available online, um, under copyright laws, I still retain copyright over this code. This code belongs to me. It's my copyright. And unless I expressly tell you how you can use the code, you're actually not allowed to use this code. And it's not too much for this code. That might not be too important. But you can imagine situations where somebody writes some scientific code and somebody wants to use that for commercial purposes, for example. You don't want to necessarily be, using other people's stuff without their permission. So what the license is actually me giving you permission to use this. And this particular license, as GitHub recognizes by looking at the text of this license, is what's called the MIT license. And it even has the description. This is a short and permissive license with conditions only requiring preservation of copyright and license notices. You can modify it, you can give it to other people, you can embed it in commercial products if you'd like, and sell those commercial products, so long as whenever you copy my code, you also copy this license along with it, and you retain this copyright notice to tell people that this is my copyright. You can do whatever you want with this code. So it's a very permissive license. I do also include, thankfully, people who know more about this stuff have also provided this kind of clause about liability, meaning if you use this code and something happens and you get hurt or somebody else gets hurt, that's not my liability. You agree to use this so long as you use it as is without any warranty of it doing anything. And also, you're not allowed to use my name or the name of my employer in order to sell products using this. So it's kind of like a very permissive on the one hand. It lets anyone use this code in whatever way they want, except for these little exceptions that shouldn't be too objectionable. So that was a short thing about software licensing. So, if you write code and you intend for other people to use that code, put a license on it. And there's a variety of licenses. I would recommend to looking at OSI. If this license is not one that you like, go to the open source initiative at opensource.org/licenses, and you can find other ways to license your code that match better what you want to do. Okay. I see we are getting very close to time here. Let me see what questions do people have at this point. All right, if no questions, oh yeah, there is a question. Nemo, please.
Right, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great talk. I had a question about organizing the module. Let's say we have a module that has a bunch of functions and a bunch of classes. Do you recommend just putting all of them in the same file, or do you think they should be separate? What's the standard for that?
Yeah, so the example I had here was a little bit like not entirely imaginary. And that there's like circle and maybe you'll have square and other things in here as
Hmm.
well. So you can kind of like thematically separate things. It's not a bad idea to put all the classes and functions that relate to a certain topic into the same place. I recommend actually looking at other kind of scientific software that you use as like inspiration. I don't know, let's look at DiPi, a library for diffusion MRI that I work on, right? It's like sprawling. It's like we're talking about, I don't know, more than 15 years of work. So there are like submodules in here. One is about um, registration. It's called Align. There's a core that is like stuff that's used all over the place. So getting some idea of like how other people have designed their libraries is not a bad idea. Reconstruction is like all the different models for reconstruction. And then you have here, for example, DTI is one model, so it has its own module, and DSI is another module and has its own module. So kind of think maybe put thematically related things together so it's easy to find. Easy to find both when you're working on the code, on the source code itself, but also easy to find when you're using the code and trying to import stuff, trying to explore this by importing that things that are thematically related are kind of in the same namespace. Um,
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions? All right, I'll just mention in kind of very briefly because I didn't have much time to talk about it, that I'll add here also like a tests. There is in this also tests folder in here. I didn't have time to talk about tests much today, but if you come back to this and you look at the tests, and maybe we'll have another session at some point about software testing because that's an important topic in itself. It's just a way to write code that tests your own code. I'll just plant that idea here now. There's actually a chapter about software testing also in our book, so you can go and look at that. It's an interesting, if everything I said so far is kind of like, oh, well, this is okay, this is interesting, potentially useful, consider going one step further to think about testing your code. So I'll push that into that repository that you'll have, and then you can look at the tests and then look at the book, and maybe hopefully there'll be a session on that as well at some point. Um, but that will be a topic for a different day. Any other questions before we wrap up here? Yes, Stephanie. Hello.
Hey, thanks, Ariel. Great to see you.
Likewise.
Um, yeah, great. So thank you, first of all, for an excellent talk. And you may have mentioned this, but I just thought I'd ask, what sort of things do you see people getting caught up on the most when they move from just like I've created a collection of scripts to analyze my data, and I want to start doing good software development practices or just, good programming practices for reusability. Are there certain things that people tend to overlook or they tend to constantly get challenged by that you've seen come up again and again?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens is that people tend to translate over their like data management, the mixture of data management and computational analysis into people. When you first start doing this, you think that, yeah, like 2 lines of code is too much to like that shouldn't be putting a function with 2 lines. But often 2 lines is enough. And rule of thumb is if your functions are longer than 40 lines, you should consider whether you should break them down. So that functions should be short. I think that's something that is hard for people coming from the data analysis. We have scripts with like hundreds of lines of code to go into this kind of more software engineering modular design. I think people struggle to break things down into like really small bits that they can then combine together. So that's one thing to keep an eye on.
That certainly resonates with me.
And one more question. Do you recommend that the name of a parent folder here, the parent geometry folder, match the one inside the source folder? That's usually how I do things. I call the library and the repository geometry, and then I expect to do something like from geometry import circle, right? So if the repository is called geometry, I expect that my import would be from something called geometry. And if I keep that name and that name the same, sort of like I did here, then that's going to be the case. The repo is called geometry. And then also the package that I import is called geometry. So that's how I usually do things. Right. Cool. If nothing further, I'm easy to find. So if you have any questions, find me. And if not, then hopefully you'll have a great rest of your day. And I hope to see you all soon in one of these or in some other context. Take care.
Thank you so much, Ariel. We really appreciate it. This is great.
And
And I know you're popping off, but it would be great if we did a GitHub one of these sometimes in the future, like you were mentioning. But yeah, thank you again. And
Yeah.
for those of you who joined late, this will be up on our YouTube and I'll send that out in an email. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks for organizing, Alex. Bye.